Leading with nearly 31 million votes so far, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is set to become the Philippines' 17th president. MRT and bus ridership levels going up following the lifting of most COVID-19 restrictions here. And is now a good time to invest in Singapore REITs, and which ones are tipped to do better this year? More on this in our Invest segment today. Hello, this is The Big Story with me, Olivia Quay. Remember to subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss an episode. A new but familiar political landscape in the Philippines as Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is on the cusp of winning the presidential election by a landslide. That name should ring a bell to you. He's the son of the late dictator who was the Philippine president from December 1965 to February 1986. And by the early hours of this morning, with over 94% of the eligible ballots counted, Mr. Marcos Jr. had topped up almost 30 million votes, surpassing the 27.5 million needed for a majority. With more is our Philippines correspondent, Raul Dancel, who joins me from Manila. So Raul, what do the results so far tell you about what Filipinos want for the future of their country?
Hi, Olivia. The vote shows a rebuke of politics as usual. It shows that Filipinos want a leader like Rodrigo Duterte, the incumbent president. Duterte styled himself as a maverick, as somebody from outside the system, as somebody who can challenge the status quo. Being so, he can bring about radical change and real progress. Now, Marcos promised to be the next Duterte. He is, in essence, in his campaign, he essentially marketed himself as Duterte 2.0. Now, whether he is really from outside the status quo is questionable given his history. But 30 million Filipinos voted for him. So I guess they believe that he is so.
Right. Well, you brought up status quo and how much, Marcos Jr. has modeled himself. Like you said, he is calling himself Rodrigo 2.0. We'll get to that later on, Raul. But first, like I said, Mr. Marcos Jr. tied his campaign to his father's presidency, which some saw as a golden era for the Philippines, but it was marred by a period of martial law and corruption. So what would a Marcos Jr. presidency look like? Would it be a continuation of how Marcos Sr. led the country?
There won't be a return to strongman rule, Olivia. No? First, Marcos Jr. doesn't have the same absolute authority over the civil service and military that his father had. Secondly, he's propped up by a wieldy alliance that can turn on him easily. So he has to compromise. I would say he will be Marcos 2.0, a government constrained or are limited by democratic institutions, but also a government that will have to compromise with its allies. It's worth noting that President Duterte said earlier that he really doesn't like Marcos. In fact, he didn't endorse Marcos. So there's friction there already. And within Marcos's alliance, you also have former President Gloria Arroyo, who has her own ideas about where the Philippines should go. And then you have the country's richest, wealthiest man, Manuel Villar, a property developer, who definitely would want to influence where the economy will go to protect his own business interest. And so a Marcos government would be one that would have to compromise with his partners as he deals with huge challenges. Duterte will be leaving a massive debt because of all the money he borrowed to fund the Philippines pandemic response. Marcos will have to deal with that debt as he seeks to deliver on his broad promises, which will require huge amounts of money. So what everyone is wondering what he plans to do with the debt, while at the same time delivering on his promises, like bringing down the price of rice by half, and building bridges, building ports, building highways. Where is he going to get that money? Does he intend to borrow his way, borrow his way to finance his program? If he does borrow, what will the debt to GDP ratio be of the Philippines? Will it be 70%? What will be the credit rating? And so we see a lot of challenges ahead of Marcos without the instruments of the same instruments that his father had, that allowed him to push his agenda.
As you said earlier, Raul, Mr. Marcos Jr. has also said he will pursue outgoing President Rodrigo Duterte's policies. Do the policies of those two presidents, and I'm talking about Marcos Sr. and Duterte here, do these policies mesh or are there contradictions?
Marcos has already said that he will pursue Duterte's drug war, but it will be less bloody. So we don't know how he will do that, but what is certain right now is that Mr. Duterte, President Duterte, will not be held accountable for crimes against humanity, that the case filed against him before the International Criminal Court will not prosper, and the policemen and the vigilantes behind the killings of drug suspects will not be held accountable. As for China, Marcos has already declared that he favors bilateral or direct talks with China over multilateralism. I think this is music to Beijing's ears, because the United States and its allies and most other nations in the region favor multilateralism to keep in check China's expansionist ambition in the region. However, I also think that Marcos will not be as hostile towards the United States as Duterte. I think he will still allow military exercises with the US and some kind of basing arrangements with American forces here in the Philippines. So I think in terms of foreign policy, Marcos's foreign policy will be more fluid than set in stone than as in Mr. Duterte's old foreign policy.
Well, let's turn to Marcos's nearest rival, Leni Robredo. Huge turnouts at her rallies, but those didn't translate into votes, with Marcos Jr. holding a wide lead in the race. What happened there, Raul?
I think the momentum behind Robredo was just a little too late. No? I think the massive rallies came 2 months before the election. And also, we have to note that the Marcos won due to a confluence of factors. First, there's the people's rage over their poverty. I've seen that myself. I've talked to people who support Marcos, and they are really very disappointed. They think that one government after one previous governments have come and go, and they're still languishing. And then there's this savvy social media blitz that directed that rage towards Robredo. So, we saw that the negative campaigning against Robredo really stuck, that the gender-based attack, the allegations that she's in league with communists, that she's elitist, all those attacks fueled by this social media blitz stuck to her. And so that hobbled her. Whereas all the attacks against Marcos, all the criticisms against Marcos, his past and all that, it didn't really stick, on him. I mean, what resonated was that the sins of the father cannot be considered the sins of the son, and so that resonated with voters, which was good for Marcos. And lastly, the third factor, which is I think the key factor, was that Sara Duterte, President Duterte's daughter, supported Marcos last year. That really changed the equation. If she had run for president, it would have been a three-way race. And in that three-way race, the top two candidates would have been Sara Duterte and Leni Robredo. Marcos would have been in third place. And so I think it's really what really tipped the balance for Marcos was Sara Duterte's support. When Sara Duterte agreed to be his running mate, I think from then on, Marcos's political rivals really had no chance at all.
Insights there from our Philippines correspondent, Raul Dancel in Manila. Thanks so much, Raul. From the Philippines' likely next leader to South Korea's new president, who was sworn in earlier today. In his inauguration speech, Yoon Suk-yeol is offering, quote, an audacious plan that will vastly strengthen North Korea's economy and improve the quality of life of its people if the regime genuinely embarks on a process to complete denuclearization. After the ceremony, Mr. Yoon held several meetings with foreign guests, including President Halima Yacob. Heavily armed troops evacuated outgoing Sri Lankan Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa from his official Colombo residence today after thousands of protesters breached the main gate. This following a day of violent protests in which 5 people were killed and nearly 200 wounded. Meanwhile, dozens of homes of top Rajapaksa loyalists were torched in Sri Lanka, which has been under a state of emergency since last Friday. And Ukrainians flocking to Kiev's World War II monument to mark Victory Day, a day that commemorates the Allied triumph over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Singaporean Ik Shen, who's in the capital city, reports.
I'm at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in the Park of Eternal Glory in Kiev, Ukraine. It's a public holiday known as Victory Day against Nazism of the Second World War. The mood has not been victorious. You can see a steady stream of people coming with flowers to remember the people who have given their lives for the liberation of Ukraine. Today, Ukraine is still struggling for their freedom against a power with imperialistic ideology. This is Ik Shen reporting for the Straits Times in Kiev, Ukraine.
In local news, a 29-year-old self-radicalized Singaporean was detained last month under the Internal Security Act. Radjev Lal Madan Lal had been influenced by the teachings of foreign radical preacher Imran Hosein and believed he needed to partake in armed violence against enemies of Islam. Well, here's what we know from the Internal Security Department. At the time of arrest, Radjev was considering traveling to conflict zones in Afghanistan to join the Taliban. And while he didn't have specific attack plans in Singapore, he admitted he was willing to conduct one here or against Singapore's interest overseas. Radjev also tried unsuccessfully to recruit and propagate his ideologies to family, friends, and people online. Lawyer and opposition politician Lim Tien will be charged in court on Thursday with criminal breach of trust, unlawful stalking, and acting as an advocate or solicitor without a valid practicing certificate. The police also say investigations against Mr. Lim for other matters are ongoing. If guilty of any of the charges, he'll face a jail term and/or a fine. MRT and bus ridership hit 78% of pre-COVID-19 levels in the last week of April after Singapore lifted most of its pandemic restrictions. This is a more than 10-point increase from the first week of January, when group sizes were capped at 5 and only up to 50% of workers could return to the workplace. The number of commuters who exited at stations in the CBD during the morning peak period stayed at 51% though, a sign that staggered working hours and telecommuting may remain for a while. And in April, prices of resale condo units edged up for the 21st straight month, but at a slower pace of 0.7% compared with March's 0.8%. Flash data also shows that compared with April last year, prices were up by 9%. Transactions, though, fell slightly as the market stabilized following property cooling measures. When it comes to investing, real estate investment trusts or REITs are a popular way for investors to get into commercial property. Now, there are 44 REITs and property trusts listed on the Singapore Exchange, and in the first quarter of this year, the top 5 performing Singapore REITs and property trusts averaged 14.1% total returns, outperforming the benchmark SGI's 9.6%. Will REITs continue to deliver for investors in the months ahead? Well, joining us is Associate Editor Lee Su-Xian. So, Su-Xian, for people looking to invest in Singapore REITs, is now a good time to put some money into that?
Well, in every investor's portfolio, I think it's a good idea to have some REITs, as they pay out their rental income on a regular basis, so you get a regular stream of income. Now, just last week, the US Federal Reserve raised rates for the first time in a long while. For REITs, the idea is that rising rates aren't good for them. Now, why? Because higher rates increases their borrowing costs. Also, if consumers are spending less, then REITs will earn less profit. But looking back at times when the rates were rising, it's not clear that there was such a direct relationship. So a good example is between 2015 and 2019, when rates went up to more than 2%, but our Singapore REITs, in fact, also went up. They went up by about 73%. Also, do note, we are now in an inflationary environment, which means our money is worth less. As at March 31st, the REITs, all the REITs in Singapore, gave a yield of about 6.1%. That's higher than the core inflation rate of 2.1% and higher than the yield on the MAS 10-year bond, and definitely higher than any fixed deposit you can get. So REITs can act as a hedge against inflation. If you take the FTSE ST REIT index or the IHS REIT index, both have delivered higher yields and less volatility when compared even with the SDI, the Dow Jones, Japan's Nikkei, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng.
I see. So, Su-Xian, when it comes to picking which REITs to invest in, which ones have analysts tipped to do better this year?
Right. Well, we're going to have the opening up of the economy, so some of the sectors that are set to do well, and in fact have already done better in the last couple of months, are the office and retail REITs. In March, the retail REITs had an average dividend yield of 7.8% and office REITs were about 7.6%. So if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. As you know, workers are switching from pajamas to workwear. For those who are keen on the US office market, SGX has Manulife US REIT, Prime US REIT, Keppel Pacific Oak US REIT. Now these three have an average distribution yield of about 8.7%. For Singapore too, you should see some upside. Now, Grade A office rents in the Central Business District, they saw the fastest quarterly growth in the first 3 months of 2022, since rents turned around in the second quarter of last year. This is according to JLL Singapore. So REITs in this sector would include, say, CapitaLand Integrated Commercial Trust. Now, it has many commercial properties. Some examples would be Capita Green and Capital Tower. This is in the Raffles Place and Tanjong Pagar area. On the retail front, we also expect to see improvement. So even though we don't see the key China market because the China tourists can't come in, but actually in March, Changi Airport already recorded, the highest passenger numbers they had seen in 2 years. Now this will be a key boost for the retail sector. So CICT, which has malls such as, Junction 8 and Plaza Singapura in its portfolio, they're already positive on the retail sector. They've already noted that they've seen higher tenant sales in the first quarter compared with a year earlier. Others in the retail sector would be, say, Lend-Lease Commercial REIT. It has 313 at Somerset and it has GEM. And another example would be Fraser Centrepoint Trust. It has properties like Causeway Point and Tiong Bahru Plaza.
Thank you so much to Lee Su-Xian, Associate Editor at the Straits Times. You can find out more about Singapore REITs and whether now's a good time to invest in them. Su-Xian's stories can be found at str.sg/invest. Also visit straitstimes.com for more news and our YouTube channel. For more videos, subscribe by hitting the red button below. I'm Olivia Quay and I'll see you tomorrow on The Big Story.